Okay, folks, I think we're ready to get started with the presentation for the evening. My name is Gamal Hennessy, and I'd like to welcome you to the Global Comics webinar for financing your independent comic. We'll open up the floor to questions at the end. So if you type in your question at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, we're going to address all your questions at the same time. Now, if you think of a question after the webinar, or if you want to get your comics onto the Global Comics platform, please feel free to email either me or Eric Tapper at the address on your screen, and we'll take care of you. Now, the purpose of this discussion is to help everyone get a better understanding of the options available to them when it comes to paying to produce and publish your comic. The combination of your money and your art can be a complex and emotional relationship, so we're going to try to keep that in mind during this discussion. To provide a framework for these ideas, we're going to break the webinar up into 5 distinct parts. First, I'm going to explain the economic realities that you have to come to terms with before you start putting money into your comic. Then, we'll look at the basics of a comic book budget so you can start to figure out how much you need to publish the comic you want. This won't be an in-depth exploration of budgeting. We're going to save that for a later webinar. The third thing we're going to look at here is some of the options for investing your own money into your comic. Then we'll figure out the ways you can get other people to invest in your comic. Finally, we'll open up the floor for questions. Just keep in mind when we get to that point that Global Comics is not offering financial or legal advice to anyone listening to this discussion. The goal is to stimulate thinking, not to tell you how to spend your money. Now, before we get too deep into the discussion, it helps to place financing within the larger framework of comic book publishing. Figuring out where your money is coming from is a fundamental element of the pre-production process and should happen before you try to hire a team or make your comic. Once you know where your money is coming from and how much money you have, you'll have a better idea of what you can accomplish in the rest of the process. Now, beyond the role of money in the comic book publishing process, we need to acknowledge the role of money in the context of life itself. Struggles with finances are not uncommon, especially among creative people. The passion to create art and make comics is often at odds with other financial obligations of the artist. This can lead to internal and external conflict that can be detrimental to both the artist and the art. So while you might be willing to make sacrifices for your comic, it makes sense to exercise responsible prudence in your decision. Because the starving artist might be a romantic trope, but it is not a goal that we recommend. Now, the first aspect of prudent investing in your comic is understanding the basic economic realities of comic book publishing. There are 3 of them. The first is to understand the difference between investment and revenue. Simply put, investment is the money that goes into your comic. Revenue is the money that comes out. The ideas that you have for your comic may be unique and inspired, but unless some sort of money is put into them, those ideas will have no value. The easiest way to understand this is to look at 2 very similar pieces of intellectual property, stories about affluent young men who survive criminal events and then use their money to gain the skills and technology to fight crime outside the law. One of them is one of the most famous pieces of pop culture in American history, and the other one nobody knows about because the money has not been put into them over an 80-year period. Now, who puts the money in, when the money is spent, how or if the money has to get paid back, are all factors you can influence. But it will be difficult for you to make comics without getting some kind of startup money from somewhere. Now, creating any kind of commercial art is a gamble, and every gamble involves risk, whether you're talking about the stock market or real estate or betting in Vegas or making comics. Because it's a risk, this means you have to be willing to lose your entire investment. You could put money into a comic that never comes out for a variety of reasons. You could release a book that doesn't sell enough to recover your initial investment, or a pandemic could cripple the entire industry for a year. Anything could happen. Your ability to manage risk is known as your risk tolerance. It's based on factors like your goals, the timeline that you have for your comic, the stage of life that you're in, and your personal comfort level. The key is to only invest money that you can afford to lose. Losing this money won't be fun, but it won't be a total disaster. The final economic reality is that you might want to make comics, but you don't have to make comics. Your readers might want to read your stories, but again, they don't have to read these stories. This is the difference between basic or fundamental spending and what's known as discretionary spending. So you need to make sure that you could continue to pay for a place to live, food to eat, and basic life necessities before you could invest in your comic. At the same time, your readers might want your comic, but it's not something they have to have if push comes to shove. The key to your investment is finding the funding mechanism that fits in with the rest of your life. Now that you have the right perspective on comic book investing, the next question is, how much money do you need? It doesn't make sense to stress about getting money when you don't even know how much money you're looking for in the first place. And this is where a budget comes in. Every comic book budget is going to be unique based on the goals of your book, but these 8 elements form the core of a comic book budget. It covers everything from forming your company and filing your copyrights, which is your initial cost, to convention attendance and website maintenance, which are covered under marketing costs, to revenue splits with Diamond or Global Comics, which is going to be your sales costs. Now, not every cost is mandatory, and not every cost has to be paid at the same time. Depending on how you structure your comic and your business, you could avoid or delay certain costs to save money. For example, if you distribute your comic digitally through Global Comics, you could avoid the printing, shipping, and storage costs associated with print distribution. If you produce a comic in black and white, you could avoid the coloring costs. If you set up certain types of companies to publish your comics, many of your business expenses can be tax deductible, increasing your chances for a tax refund in the future. Now, before we dive into the actual financing options, there's an idea that is important enough to be repeated. We are not giving you financial advice or telling you how to spend your money. We are fully aware that all of these options I'm about to explore are not available to everyone listening to this webinar. We're only trying to offer the complete range of financing ideas for you to consider. More importantly, we're not suggesting anyone sell their house, spend their kids' college money, or go all Breaking Bad to pay for your comic. You need to be a prudent publisher, not a starving artist. Sources of investment only really have 2 basic sources: your money and other people's money. We'll start with your investment first before we try to reach into someone else's pocket to publish your comic. Personal investment options are fairly straightforward, but each one has its own benefits and downsides. For example, a 401k or an IRA are formal saving structures that allow you to borrow against the money that you put into them, but there can be substantial penalties for early withdrawal. At the same time, selling your personal property might not be a consistent way to generate revenue. They might not be reliable in terms of the price of the money that you bring in. And taking freelance work to pay for your comic might be challenging if you have a day job, a family that you spend time with, all the while you're trying to make your own comics. When it comes to getting other people to invest in your comic, the important thing to understand is that in many of these scenarios, the people or companies giving you money have no knowledge of or no interest in your comic. What they are looking for is to make money by giving you money, either by having you pay interest in addition to paying back the original sum or the principal, or by getting ownership of some other property you currently possess. Investors who are interested in your comic will look for certain information from you, including your pitch, your tagline, your synopsis, proof that you own the idea that you're going to be using to make a comic, your copyright registration, your public domain analysis, your license agreements, your marketing data, your distribution channels, your projected sales, your financial contribution to the project, and your budget. Other investors are going to be looking for much more specific financial information, including your credit score or the value of the collateral that you are using to get this money. Outside investment can come from individuals in the forms of gifts, personal loans, or private investment. Or it could come from financial institutions in the form of credit cards or home equity line of credit, or HELOC. They could require no repayment at all with something like a grant, or they could involve significant damage to your credit rating, loss of your property, or bankruptcy if you default. Other comic creators who join your project in exchange for a piece of the ownership of the IP, and publishers who are open to creator-driven deals also represent a certain kind of private investment that is unique to the comic book industry. But as I said, each one of these options requires a clear understanding of the legal obligations contained in the contract and a pragmatic decision before you choose any of them as a financing option. Now, some of you might be wondering why I didn't mention crowdfunding as a financing option for comics. Comics generate millions of dollars every year from crowdfunding. Everyone from Scott Snyder to Keanu Reeves are starting to kickstart their comics these days. There was an article very recently that crowdfunding has generated more money for comics this year than it has ever generated before. And I recently ran a successful Kickstarter of my own. So why would I leave this out? The answer lies in where crowdfunding fits in the publishing process we discussed earlier. Crowdfunding is best understood as a source of revenue, which is step 10, not as a source of investment, which is step 4. Anyone who has backed a Kickstarter or run one knows that you need to put in a substantial sum of time and money before the campaign starts. You need to have contracts in place. You need to create artwork for the project, if not the full comic itself. Next slide, please. You might need to bring in someone to handle marketing. You need to figure out fulfillment and distribution. All those things require some kind of financial investment before announcing your Kickstarter. Now, down the line, after you've established a reputation in the industry, you might be able to run a successful project with nothing more than your name and an idea. But that's not a realistic financing option for new publishers. Now, after you've made a budget, dipped into your own pocket, and sought out realistic financing from others, you might come to the sober realization that you don't have responsible access to the money you need to make the comic you want. Next slide, please. At this point, it pays to understand the relationship between good, fast, and cheap. In the production of comics, or anything really from an artistic standpoint, it is often difficult to create something good, fast, and cheap all at the same time. Sacrifices have to be made somewhere along the line, but this reality can be leveraged to your benefit. If you look at the upper right-hand corner of this image and apply it to your comic, you can see that it can be good in terms of quality and cheap in terms of cost, but it's not necessarily going to be produced quickly. If you could spread your costs over time and reduce your costs by learning the skills that you would otherwise pay someone else for, you can publish comics without making yourself homeless. No one wants to wait to see their book on the shelf, but a long-term prudent plan often makes more sense than rushing into financial failure. So that quick introduction concludes the presentation portion. So we're going to open up the call for questions now. We're also going to send around a survey. So if there are any topics that you would like us to discuss in a future webinar, like going in depth into budgeting or standard pricing for different types of services related to comic book publishing, you can share your opinions about our presentation in the survey. So thank you all for taking the time to listen, and we hope this helps you with your comic book publishing. So let's start looking at the questions. Tony Cade said Vigilante isn't that bad. Another Wolfman creation. That's actually true. And actually highlights the point that I was making. The character itself, the idea and the story isn't the reason why it's not very well known. It's that over a certain period of time, investment has been made into one character, Batman, versus Vigilante, in terms of page rates, in terms of licensing fees, in terms of marketing and development. Vigilante, in a different world, Vigilante could be just as popular as Batman, but he's not, because the money simply wasn't put into that character. That goes for any character owned by any company. The amount of money put in will have a direct impact on the overall popularity of the character. Let's see. Considering that even initiating or not a comic is an economic decision, what would be the bottom line regarding revenue that one should consider? Say, yeah, I don't. Alvaro, I don't think there is a hard and fast line or a specific number that you need to look at and say you won't do the project, because there's so many factors that go into the decision to make a project. Like if your goal is simply to get a story out, but you can't pay tens of thousands of dollars for page rates and for printing and for distribution, you might be able to make a very successful, very fulfilling project, but do that in something like webcomics or producing it on something like Global Comics, where the cost to actually get your story out into the world is much lower. There could be other instances where you decide, well, you're going to build up your savings over time and build up the quality of the project over time, so that by the time you're actually ready to release it, then you actually have the cash that you need. In talking to creative people who are trying to make comics, I don't want anyone to actually go, well, there's no money and therefore I'm never going to do this project. There's ways to actually figure out how to get around it so that you can make the comic that you want to make. Jarrell, has it ever happened where a comic creator reached out to funders online like foundations that may ask for comic creators to submit an application for a grant? Yes, there are actually a whole list of grants, and they fall under the rubric of artistic grants, but they're ones that have been specifically created for comic creators and illustrators. What we can do after the webinar is send out a link, because there's two individuals that actually maintain lists of all of the different types of comic related grants. So yes, there are comic book grants. Yes, we could actually share that information with you so that you can apply for some of those grants and tap into some of that money. And keep in mind, when you're getting a grant, the upside of that is it's money that you're going to get to produce your comic that you're not going to have to pay back, even if the comic book makes a lot of money. The downside is that you're going to have to take a significant amount of time and energy to fill out the grant forms exactly the way they need to be filled out. Understand that there's a lot of people competing for the grant, so you're not guaranteed to get it. And there could be some restrictions on what type of book or the content of the book if you're getting a grant, depending on the organization. So if it's something that's going to impact your artistic vision, you have to think about that before you actually apply for that grant. But grants are something that you definitely should take advantage of if you can. If I have the first comic finished, what are some of the ways I can leverage this to gain more investment to make more? Also, with the first comic done, what's the best way to make sure you're getting the most exposure and sales to make your comic even more successful? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get very meta on this answer, Joe. And basically what I'm going to tell you is, if you put more effort, not necessarily money, into your marketing, you will actually, by definition, increase your exposure and your sales. Because once you increase the number of people that are interested and want your comic, you will actually increase the amount of revenue that's going to come out of it. Global Comics has done 2 marketing webinars that actually go very specifically, and you may have already heard them, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating what you've already heard, that go very specifically into how to actually build up your market to actually build up your revenue. one of the things that we're actually doing inside of Global Comics is we are making very specific use of a platform called Reddit, which actually has very granular distribution of different types of groups interested in different types of stories. So we actually feed in different types of comics specifically into those groups that they're not comic book readers. They may like horror, they may like mecha combat, they may like romance. And because Global Comics has all of that kind of content, if you feed in or introduce that kind of content into all those groups, you have a lot more people coming to check out the book, which will then translate into readers, which will then translate into revenue. So if you go back and look at some of our marketing webinars, and we can give you those links too, you can actually get an idea of how you actually build a market to increase sales with a book that you already have. Let's see, we are working on a copyright assignment form for our artists. The copyright for the okay, David, that is a very specific legal copyright question that has doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. So what you could do, you could actually email me separately and I will help you with that because it's not that complicated of an answer, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Brendan, I love comics and I'm very excited to publish my own, but the current state of indie comics seems to be a case where business are running at a perpetual loss. Now, this could be chalked up to the fact my lack of business savvy with the high cost of printing books and the ancillary costs like shipping and marketing. Is it viable for small publishers to make a profit off their books? Yes, there is a way for indie comics to make a profit off of their books if you do two things. One, if you reduce the cost of producing your book, and two, if you increase the market for your book. Now, you may be in a position where you already have sunk costs. You already put in a certain amount of money to produce your book, which means because you paid the page rates, you paid for printing, you paid for shipping, and now they're sitting in a storehouse somewhere. What you need to do then is, like I was telling in answering the last question, build up the market for your books. The reason why so many comic book publishers and creators are running at a loss is because everyone's trying to fight for the same group of readers, which is a very small group of people compared to the population of the United States or the world, and B, those readers already have comic books that they like. If you are an indie publisher, especially if you're an indie publisher, your main road to success is going to be finding those people who like the type of story you're writing, but don't read comic books yet. We call that the potential market in our marketing webinars. Once you actually get a community of those people and you connect with them, you can actually sell them your stories on a much more successful basis than everyone trying to cannibalize the same small group of readers, 80% of which are reading Marvel and DC anyway. So yes, you can make money, but not if you keep doing what everyone has been doing since the 80s. How much is too much paying for an artist? Well, let me just say that depending on the artist that you want and the money that you have, there is no such number. Because for example, if I want to make a comic and Jim Lee said, well, I'll draw your comic. Well, oh my God, Jim Lee can draw my comic for however much money he wants, as long as I have it. Now, if I said, I'm going to draw your comic, well, paying me $5 a page is too much because I'm a horrible artist. So it's not a hard and fast number about how much is too much to pay for your artist. It's what is your budget? What is the skill and popularity of the artist? Because a certain artist will bring in more eyeballs to your book, so they may actually justify their price. There's a complex matrix in figuring out what to pay an artist. So as long as you keep that in mind, you'll go, well, this artist is worth X, that artist is worth Y, and then you'll be able to figure out which way to go in terms of picking your artist. Don asks, where does Patreon fit into this? Patreon is a rather unique case because on a certain level, it is crowdfunding, which means it is actually a part of revenue generating and not investment. However, because Patreon is an ongoing type of donation system, while it may not be an investment option in the beginning of your comic book publishing, after you've built a market over time, like your early Patreon backers can actually be the ones investing in your future work. They may not be able to invest in your original work. So Patreon is in the beginning a revenue stream, but over time in your development of your comic book publishing, they could be a source of revenue, and that would make them revenue. That would be other people's money. There you go.
I think let me add into that actually. Patreon is unique in that what it enables you to do really is to solicit funding from your core super fans, not necessarily even with providing something in return immediately, because these are people that truly believe in what you are doing and are willing to support you. And generally speaking, you're not asking for a large amount of money up front. And so you can kind of think of Patreon as a friends and family style of getting off the ground. But then once you actually become more successful, there's a choice that you can make around, do you want to paywall your content and go that route? Or do you want to make it for free if you have a big enough audience of super fans? And that particular model is one that we are seeing explored a lot, in the past year or two or so. And one that Global Comics is actually coming up with a product that integrates directly into our publishing platform. More information on that will be available in the next couple of weeks.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir. Joe asked, digital and physical print, what platforms are good for selling your digital PDF comics? And when selling physical print comics to be shipped, is that much more financially costly? Not sure if we stay in digital or move to physically printed soft cover comics. Well, to answer your first question, what platforms are good for selling your digital PDF comics? The best platform for that is going to be Global Comics, because for two reasons. One, we can actually give you the platform to drive traffic to your PDF comic very quickly. Two, your PDF comic can get uploaded into Global Comics within the next 5 minutes. You're not going to have to wait a long time to get the comic up and running. Three, there's 3 or 4 different monetization models that we have for your comics. So once the book is actually live, you can make money in several different ways based on how you actually interact with your community. So Global Comics is the way to publish your PDF comics. When selling physical print comics to be shipped, is that much more financially costly? Well, that depends on a lot of factors, including what kind of paper you're using, what kind of printing method you're using. Are you using offset? Are you using print on demand? Where your printer is it a local printer, a national printer, or an international printer? And how large your book is. So depending on all those factors, it could be very costly. And you also have to consider, depending on how many copies you're printing, you might have to store them somewhere, and might have to pay for that. So when you actually factor in paper, printing, shipping, storage, it can be exponentially more expensive to distribute print comics than to distribute digital comics, because digital comics is basically you press a button, it's on Global Comics, the next day you're making money, you didn't spend anything. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth and pushback between print and digital in the comic book market, but the fact of the matter is there's a group of people who I'm old. So there are people out in the world who love the sound of vinyl records. So there will always be vinyl records, and there will always be that group of people who love vinyl records. And it's the same thing with comics. There will always be people who want print comics. But more and more, in the same way it happened with music, people moved towards digital, to the point now that there are very few record stores left, and there are a lot more digital avenues to get music.
Come on, can I hop in here?
What?
Can I hop in here for a second?
Oh, yes, because you're the musician, so please.
Hello, everybody. This is Eric. I'm the one silently pulling the puppet strings of the presentation here. I think something else that's really important to keep in mind, that a lot of times digital, it does not always translate to the same per unit cost, right? You're not always going to get the same dollar value from a digital sale. But the main difference, as Gamal mentioned, is that a physical also costs a lot more to buy, and that there will always be vinyl sales. So I think something that we are, I think changing our thinking around that might also be helpful, because platforms, let's say music like Spotify, or in digital comics like Global Comics or Webtoon or what have you, can also serve as a marketing platform. And then if you're able to get more and more people interested, you're actually getting them one step closer to buying something that's a higher value item. So there's a lot of success stories from artists you've never heard of that are just existing in their universe of fans that like to listen to their music or read their comics, on a digital platform. And then there's another funnel, another layer behind that of people that just want to buy a physical copy, a vinyl copy, what have you. So it's not necessarily that it's digital or print necessarily, but you can actually leverage digital because of how easy it is to share it with people, to drive more people to buy those high value items, if that's something that's one of your goals.
Yes, you can actually use a digital to print pipeline, getting people like absorbed in the story on a digital platform where it's cheaper, and then they'll buy the print version or the merchandise or the t-shirt or the toy later because they're emotionally invested in that digital copy that they saw first. Let's see, Grant, do you recommend taking out a small personal loan in order to start a comic and then taking it to crowdfunding to finish it? First, we're not actually recommending anything. There is a paradigm where people take out a loan to underwrite the cost of a project and then plan with the hopes of paying back that loan with the revenue that comes in. That is a very basic type of financial model. As long as in your profit and loss statements, when you're actually conceiving of how the revenue is going to get distributed, when you're setting your crowdfunding goal, you have to build in not only paying off all the production costs of your book, you have to figure in paying back the principal, and you have to figure out paying back the interest on the principal based on how much money you borrowed and what the terms were. So personal loans is a avenue that you can take, as long as you actually make sure you factor that in, so that when the crowdfunding is over, you actually have enough to cover the loan that you took out. You also have to have a contingency plan for if the crowdfunding fails, because now you have no revenue at all. You still have to pay back the loan and the interest on top of your other production costs. So it is, like we said in the webinar, it is a risk, but you have to factor in that risk when you're actually looking at, what it is your options are. Rob asks, how does a new creator know the prices that are industry standard are fair so they don't get taken advantage of? Well, I can answer that question for you right now, because by and large, there are no industry standards in terms of things like page rates or printing costs or anything like that, because every publisher, every person paying for something uses a lot of different factors to figure out what they're going to pay. And everyone who's actually accepting that money uses a lot of different factors to figure out what they're going to accept. So it is now there are averages, the average page rates for an artist, the average page rate for a letterer, Sure, but everyone's going to get a different number because they're bringing different things to the table, and they are actually willing to accept certain things from the people that they're interacting with. The main problem in comics is, especially when you're looking at larger publishers, is that there are confidentiality clauses in the contract that do not allow creators to actually discuss how much they are or are not getting paid for any particular publisher, which means a lot of new publishers are in the dark as to what is a good page rate for an artist. There's also the factor of international pay, which means that if I'm an American publisher, but I actually contract out work to India or the Philippines, I'm paying a lot less per page than I'm paying if I'm, hiring somebody who lives in Manhattan. So the idea that fair page rates is, Alvaro just shared that. Fair page rates is a survey and a site that was actually started in 2016 or 15. I think it's still being maintained today, but those rates are A, averages, B, they're about 4 years old, and C, again, what people are actually willing to pay is not actually based on any fixed amount like what the numbers are in page rates. So because there's a lack of information and because there's so much fluctuation, what you need to do is actually figure out how much works for you in terms of, can I actually produce pages at this rate and not be homeless? Because if you can do that, okay, that's fine. But it doesn't matter what the standard is if you can't live off of it, or you can't actually, it's not worth your while to do it. And I know that was a long and convoluted answer, but comics is a strange beast when it comes to who gets paid and how they get paid. What are your views on print to order like Amazon that give you both print and digital copies? Well, Amazon has a program called, I believe it's still called CreateSpace, where it's basically print on demand. And the trick with them is once you actually use their system, the book goes straight onto Amazon and it's available for sale through that channel. That actually works I know it works for print books because I actually wrote like 6 novels and I used CreateSpace to do it. I don't know in terms of the quality of the paper relative to what other more specific printers are doing in the printing space. I don't know how that actually shakes out. I don't know if you're planning on bookstore distribution, not outside of Amazon, or library distribution. They're not very fond of Amazon, so they may not want to actually go that route. And there's not a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can get from Amazon in terms of changing things, because they're Amazon and you're not, and you're just going to take whatever they give you as far as they're concerned. So if you wanted a very specialized type of book in terms of their physical kind of characteristics, Amazon may not be the right place to go. But if you really want to take advantage of Amazon's platform because you feel you can drive traffic to Amazon and get a lot of more sales that way, then it might make more sense for you.
I think I want to jump in on that one too, actually. The one thing that you will not get from Amazon is a lot of detailed analytics and data on where your sales come from, who's buying it, how they discover your content, etc. And so if you're trying to use that to figure out where your readers are or whether or not your marketing is being effective, then Amazon is not your cup of tea, unfortunately.
That is true. One of the things that Global Comics offers that none of the other platforms offer is a in-depth, detailed way to figure out where your readers are coming from, who's actually reading what, and how you're actually can be able to tweak that process to increase your readers and increase your sales. So, I mean, when I was answering the question, I was primarily looking at the physical aspect, but yeah, if you're looking at digital, then Amazon and Comixology are not going to be the ways to go, especially if you're an independent. How can creators combine resources to make this process more affordable? the easiest way for comic creators to form Voltron and make a more affordable process is if you bring in enough creators who have enough of the different skill sets required to make a comic that everyone's going to donate their time and effort for little or no money in order to get the comic book off the ground. Now, in exchange for that, everyone's probably going to want either a piece of the revenue, or B, a piece of the underlying ownership of the book itself. So whoever came up with the original idea can decide, well, I'm going to share ownership of this comic with the 8 people who are coming together to make it. And that's perfectly fine as long as you have that in what's called a collaboration agreement with your other creators. But you have to keep in mind, and this may not be a concern for a lot of comic creators, but it should be, is that you never know which comic is going to strike lightning and be the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Transformers or whatever. If you split the ownership among 8 people, you're now splitting the ownership of what might be a very long-term lucrative property. If that's something you're comfortable with, that's fine. If you're not comfortable with that, then it might make more sense to limit the number of contributors or find some way to actually divide the revenue stream from the ownership potential so that one group can actually have ownership of the book over another. More than trademark, secured, apply for domain name, sign word for hard. What else is proof of ownership? Well, the proof of ownership comes in 3 basic forms, depending on the type of book that you're actually working on. If you have an original idea, then if you actually have the copyright and you've actually filed the copyright with the Library of Congress, you don't need anything else as long as you're the one whose name is on the copyright. You don't necessarily need the domain name, you don't need the trademark, unless you have a specific situation where you need trademark protection as opposed to copyright protection. In work for hire agreements, you also need so that everyone who does work on the book cannot then claim ownership of part of the copyright. But if you're talking about something like a public domain comic, then you don't need any proof of ownership because you don't own the idea, because by definition, public domain is something that anyone can use those characters or those stories. And if it's in a comic that you're making based on a property that someone else owns, you need a licensing agreement to prove that you have the right to actually use that idea. So if you're making, I don't know, Aliens versus Predator, well, Dark Horse already did that. But if you were doing Aliens versus Predator, then you can actually get the license, and that proves that you have the right to make that book. You mentioned cutting costs. What are the more affordable ways to distribute to readers? The most affordable way in comics to distribute books to readers is digital, as opposed to print. There is really no comparison because of paper costs, printing costs, shipping costs, storage costs of print comics. So if you went with a platform like Global Comics, when you get the final pages of your book and you're ready to actually distribute, you go to Global Comics, you set up an account, you take 5 minutes, you upload your comics, and then you have the potential to distribute it around the world in multiple different languages at any time of day to anyone, anywhere, and it actually costs you 0. So if you're actually trying to cut costs, that in terms of distribution, that is the easiest way to cut costs. Go to digital, don't go to print. Joe, let's say I'm taking out a loan and the first comic is done and polished. What would be a good way to spend the money? Marketing, exposure. Okay, that is a very specific and very complex question that and the answer to that would lie in what your goals for the book are, who your market actually is, how much connection you've already done with your market, what is your book actually about, and what it is that you're planning on doing going forward in terms of where that book is going to go. So if you took out a loan after you actually made the comic, then the idea that I would have in my head is to actually maximize the revenue that you have from the comic that you made so that you have money to pay back both the principal and the interest and hopefully make a profit. So it would probably be more in terms of marketing the book to the right group of people so that you can sell more issues of the comic. But let me just say, in 2021, you don't need to take out a loan to market your comic. You can market your comic for little or no money, especially if the first issue is made. All you need to do is figure out who your market is, connect with your market, and give them the opportunity to buy the book that you already made. We have marketing webinars that are online on YouTube that you can watch that will explain to you how to build your market without spending any money. So you don't have to take out that loan and don't have to deal with those interest payments. Let's see, Rob. If an artist work for hire and the project gets picked up and makes millions, could they have the rights of future projects? If an art, again, this is, well, we can answer this one. And a work for hire contract written the right way, in most cases, insulates the publisher from the claim later by a work for hire artist that they have rights to profit. Because what a work for hire contract is supposed to do by definition is transfer all rights and ownership of that work to the person paying for that work. So if you don't have a work for hire contract and then all of a sudden Netflix calls you on the phone, whoever worked on that book is going to want a piece of that money and they're going to be entitled to it. But in the same way, thousands of artists and writers work for Marvel every single year. And Marvel makes a lot of money off of all of those properties and interactive and film and TV and merchandise and what have you. Those artists do not make any of that money. Those artists get a page rate. They might get what's called back-end participation based on how big they are and what name they have, what characters they created, whatever. But the basic concept is you do the work, you get paid for the work, and then you walk away. The magic of being a work for hire artist is the comic book could fail completely. The comic book could never come out, but the work for hire artist got his money or her money and left. The per person actually taking the risk of putting the book out actually has the benefit of actually pulling any money that comes in as long as he has the right contracts in place. So the short answer to your question is you have to have it in the contract that the artist does not actually have the rights to any future profits. How soon is too soon to focus on marketing and advertising for a product? Is there any kind of metric as to how much to allocate for marketing budget in comparison to the overall budget? Yes, I can answer both of these questions. First, how soon is too soon is before you actually understand whether or not you have the right to make the book you're going to make, that's too soon to market. Before you actually have a creative team or any kind of materials to use for your marketing, that's too soon to market. But other than that, you should be marketing your book and building your audience as early in the process as possible so that when the book comes out, there is a hungry group of readers ready to actually read your comic. In the same way, if you look at the Hollywood film industry, they will actually announce that a movie is greenlit 2 or 3 years before they have a movie, because over those 2 or 3 years, they're going to be working to build up that marketing. When they add principal actors who have name recognition and they have sneak peeks and they have interviews and they have all the other stuff, that's marketing. And that happens long before the movie comes out. If you're doing a comic, you should actually be doing the same thing. Build the market before the book actually is produced. In terms of metrics for allocating budget for marketing, I recommend you actually allocate the same amount of marketing budget in terms of money as you do in time. And that is 10 to 20% of the time you spend making your comic or producing your comic should be spent marketing your comic. So 10 to 20% of the budget that you have for your comic should be spent marketing your comic, whether that's going to be convention appearances or events or maintaining and building your website or any of those other things. You should actually take that and say, I'm going to build a market, because if you don't have a group of people to read the book, the fact you could make a masterpiece of a comic, but if no one's there to read it, then the only person who's going to enjoy it is you. What are some of examples of successful projects we should observe and study? Successful projects, well, I'm assuming you're talking about indie books now, and you're not talking about mainstream comics. If you look at the people who are actually able to finance or generate revenue from their book through something like crowdfunding on a consistent basis, something like Iron Circus Comics, or someone, or company like Away Blue Worlds, or a company like Mad Cave, who are able to actually get a certain amount of market share, even though the market is tight, because of the types of books that they're producing, because of the where they're actually distributing them. You can actually see a lot of the success stories coming out that are in comics. There's a lot of success stories in webtoons itself, where people are, with very little upfront money, with very little fanfare, and with very little costs, are actually getting a lot. They can generate a market and they can create a lot of traffic, which then they can actually translate into revenue based on how it is that they're positioning themselves in the market. So that would be my, if you want case studies on how to do it. What are your thoughts on how someone can get investment for a book that is free to read and probably never printed? Well, there is what's called indirect forms of revenue, where you are actually, the way you generate revenue is by collecting. Now, this is going to be a crude term, but in advertising, we are all referred to as eyeballs, because if the advertisers can generate enough eyeballs, they can then sell those eyeballs to an advertiser and generate money, revenue that way. That is how a lot of content sites online generate money. They generate money through clicks or through advertising that is embedded onto their site. So if you have a lot of people coming to your site every day, and you have it's a specific group of people that a specific product or service wants that the attention of those people, that's how you make money when you give away something for free. That is the fundamental business model of network television, of YouTube, of a lot of different sites. You're selling interest. You generate interest by making a comic book that a certain group of people like, and then giving them that comic for free, but then you're not selling the comic, you're selling them to someone else. It's a roundabout way, and that's why it is referred to as indirect revenue generation.
I'll jump in on this one too, actually. The other thing to think about here is what Eric was talking about earlier, which is that even if you are making something for free, if you are building an audience, 5,000 people, 10,000 people, 50,000 people, doesn't really matter exactly what that number is. But if you get an audience that is significant, that is dedicated to your story, and that is dedicated to what you are putting out, the odds that they will also be interested in things like merchandise or secondary products is also probably pretty high. And that's why you see, a bunch of successful webcomic creators that have their own, weekly webcomic or what have you, have a merchandise store, and they have t-shirts and they have mugs and they have mouse pads and like all these kinds of things that the folks that are really into that art and that story are happy to pay a small price for in order to support their favorite creators.
Exactly. Joe, would love to know more about building your market. We thought about going through an indie comic studio because they have an audience, but they declined, and now making something very similar to us. Any tips on building a huge audience outside your own friends and social media pages? Eric, if you get a chance in the chat, if you haven't done it already, because I'm not looking at the chat, could you share the link to the webinar that we did? Because we outlined very specific steps on how to build an audience by deconstructing your own comic to actually understand who the ideal reader is, and then using that information to not only figure out who your direct competition is, but where your potential market lives, how to actually get to them, how to actually interact with them, and build the type of long-term relationship that will give them the incentive to actually buy your comic or help you generate revenue. However you decide to do that, it is my philosophy that every book, no matter what it's about or how it's made or where it's made, has an audience. The book fails because the people who are making the book don't find the right audience. They try to sell the book to quote unquote everybody. Everybody has never wanted anything ever in the history of anything. Every piece of content is geared towards a specific group of people. You have to actually find and communicate with that specific group of people. Then you can actually build up your market. And it, on a certain level, doesn't even make a difference if there are a lot of other concepts or a lot of other stories in that market, as long as you actually find your own niche in that market. Take, for example, zombie apocalypse stories. There are a lot of zombie apocalypse stories in every form of media right now. Probably too many. But every new one that comes out can actually find a foothold because they tweak the formula a little bit and enough to actually tap into that huge market of zombie apocalypse loving people and then, make their market. So similar concepts are not necessarily a barrier as long as you find the group of people that need to read your story and not just any random story.
Gamal, somebody, Kenneth asked in the chat where they can buy the business of independent comic book publishing.
Oh, that's a sad story. Well, it's not actually a sad story. not for me. The business of independent comic book publishing was a Kickstarter that ran in September, and it was a very successful Kickstarter. So much so that I was contacted by a literary agency and secured representation from that agency to get the book distributed with a mainstream publisher. However, we are still in negotiations with said mainstream publisher, and until that relationship is announced, I can't sell any other copies of the book because then I'd be cutting into their market, which makes them a kind of upset, which, I don't want to bite the hand that potentially feeds me. So the people who backed the book are on the Kickstarter. They're going to get their copy in the next 2 weeks, digital or print. Everybody else is going to have to wait, until the book comes out. However, if you go on to Global Comics' blog, a lot of the topics that I cover in the book are also covered in those blog posts, just broken out in a different kind of format. So there's a lot of useful material that's already available that's just not in this lovely package right here. Hope that helps. What are good resources for determining related costs? Now, when you say determining related costs, I'm assuming you're talking about production costs, distribution costs, sales costs, and things like that. Good resources for determining those are going to be sporadic and widespread, and they're going to be time sensitive because, like we were saying before, there is no standard for things like page rates. There is no fixed price for something like printing costs or shipping costs or storage costs for that matter. What you have to do is once you actually decide what kind of book you want to make and how you want to get it to your readers, you then have to do the due diligence on each aspect of the process to actually get quotes from a lot of different sources to then figure out which ones make more sense for your book and for your budget. Joe, how much is too much money to invest in marketing a comic? Is it based on what is working to get the eyes on project base? or budget, or is it based on the budget number as applied to branding of the company? Well, okay, first, branding the company and marketing the comic are two slightly different things. For example, when Marvel brands Marvel, they're not necessarily branding Moon Knight. Moon Knight is just Moon Knight, and when they spend money on Moon Knight, that'll be the Moon Knight marketing. So that's just as one differentiation I wanted to make. But in terms of how much is too much, I would say you have to base it on your overall budget, because you're working with a finite amount of money. So you can't market something so much that you don't actually have money left to make it. So the marketing cost shouldn't actually overwhelm your production costs or your printing costs or anything like that. There's no point, for example, going to a convention is one of the costs of marketing if you decide to go to conventions. But it doesn't make sense to get a huge booth at San Diego Comic-Con. Hopefully we can all go to San Diego Comic-Con again very soon. But to get that huge booth and pay all that money, if you haven't paid the money to actually make the comic. The reason we suggest 10 to 20% of your overall budget, because we feel that's the sweet spot. So it's enough money and time that you're actually using to build a market, but there's enough money left over to cover all the other associated costs with putting out a comic. Are you able to share with us some sample sales figures for comics books being sold using the Global Comics platform? I'm curious about how much money creators are generating from using the platform. Also, I'm concerned about the reach of the platform. Chris, I think
sir.
this is
So,
one you should take.
Mark, unfortunately for you and everyone else listening, I'm not going to give you any of the sales numbers for anyone. That is because it's both confidential and also because it doesn't really make much sense. And I'll tell you why. The amount of money that people make fundamentally depends on three things. One, how much are they actually trying to actively promote and drive people to the content that they put online? Two, how engaged are they with our weekly marketing and promotions that we as Global Comics do, and are able to help provide, graphic assets and all these kinds of things for our own promotions. And three, it's not even just about having a paywall, because monetization on Global Comics can be Patreon style with recurring donations. In addition to paywalls, the amount of money coming from paywall alone doesn't necessarily make sense. I'll use an example of a webcomic creator who has 40 or 50 folks that are donating on a regular basis. And if I were to say that the average donation size was between $5 and $7, that's pretty good for a free-to-read comic starting up. The other part to keep in mind is that Global Comics is a fairly young product, and so while we are growing considerably month over month, we're still relatively small, and that's to the tune of about 40 to 50,000 uniques on a monthly basis as it stands right now. Let me see. I'm gonna hop in. I'm gonna answer the other question here from Alvaro, who says, asking this just out of curiosity, no hostility, but what does Global Comics offer for digital fulfilling from Kickstarter comics that can't be made just sharing a drive or Dropbox link or going with Gumroad? Well, there's many things. First and foremost, if you're sharing a drive or Dropbox link, it's usually download of a PDF. And so you're kind of expecting the person to download it and read it on their computer for the most part. Which means that mobile devices in many cases is out of the question. So it's not really an easy consumable format nor location for folks to read on the go. That changes once you have a platform like Global Comics that actually takes your PDFs and converts it into readable images and serves it in a streaming fashion as people are going through from page to page, which can be done on any device. I was even reading comics on my TV just to test out whether or not it would work. And it turns out it works really well, especially with our interactive reading experience. But the biggest thing that you won't get from any of those is you're not building a community. and you don't know who your readers are, and you don't know where they're coming from. And if you are sharing it out, you don't know how effective anywhere that you are sharing those links out is. I mean, you could, wrap it in a bit.ly and get clicks, but that doesn't really give you the kind of information that you want if you're trying to build an audience that follows you through chapter 1 to 2 to 3 to 10 to 15, as it were. And being able to look at, if you are doing your own promotions, or you're doing your own newsletters, or you're sharing on Reddit, or you're sharing on Facebook, etc., and being able to see that if you're spending 90% of your time in locations that aren't converting folks, then you're wasting your time. And what you really want to be able to do then is go, okay, well, what is working? Why is it working? And how can I do more of that? So you can be more efficient with your digital activity and your digital audience building.
All right, let me see if I can answer Joey's question. For an independent publisher, would Kickstarter be an efficient long-term distributor for a completed book? If not, what are ways to invest money into distribution? Well, Kickstarter is not a long-term distributor. Kickstarter is based on time-sensitive campaigns, which means after the campaign is over, then you have to find another distribution method to kind of get your book out into the world. In a lot of cases, what a lot of creators and publishers, even publishers like Boom and Image and places like that, are doing now is they're using Kickstarter and crowdfunding platforms as a kind of launch event kind of platform. So like there'll be a lot of hype for the first 30 days for a book on Kickstarter. And then the book might be available for retail, through normal distribution channels after the Kickstarter is over and the backers have actually received their product. If you're looking at long-term distribution, the key to where you should actually invest your time and money is, again, based really on the book that you're trying to market and who those readers are. Because the direct market is good for certain types of readers who like to read certain types of comics, but they're not necessarily good for other types. There's small bookstore chain distribution. There's digital distribution that we talked about. There's library distribution. There was, and hopefully there still will be again, convention distribution, so that you can utilize all different types of distribution channels. But if you have to, the first question you have to ask is, where are my readers going to actually be? And then figure out how much it's going to cost you to distribute to them where they are. It's very hard for you to convince a group of people, for example, let's say people who don't live anywhere near a comic book shop. Well, then you can't put your book in a comic book shop and then force your readers to go to the shop, because they just won't go and they won't read your book. You have to go, well, okay, if my readers aren't near comic book shops, where are they? What do they do? One of the reasons Global Comics has the potential that it does is that it actually visits people, no matter what kind of stuff they read, where they actually are. Most people are either with their phones, with their computers, or on social media. And that's where we can actually use Global Comics to actually drive all those readers to the product without asking them to go to a shop or a convention or anything else. To wrap up this answer, figure out who your readers are and where they shop, and then you can figure out your distribution. It's not the other way around. What is the best paper for printing? Well, I don't really know what the best paper for printing is, because there's a lot of different factors that go into printing, and the ideas, and it's also based on where you're printing and how much you're printing. So that is a much more detailed question than I could answer here, especially if we're talking about an amorphous concept like best. Is it common to split any profit off a comic 50-50 with the writer and artist? In my experience, it is fairly common for whoever's going to own the intellectual property tied to a comic to split the revenue, profit, and ownership equally. So if it's a writer and artist, it's 50-50. If it's a writer, artist, colorer, letterer, they might split it 25% or whatever. However, that is not necessarily taking into account the potential revenue streams and the effort that goes into each one. So for example, if you have a book that actually spins off merchandise like posters or t-shirts or things like that, you could split the revenue from the merchandise 50-50 between the artist and the writer. But most of the actual content that is being used to sell the poster and the t-shirt isn't necessarily the story, it's the image that the artist made. So in some cases with people that I've worked with before, the artist gets a little bit more of the visual based, revenue, and the writer gets more of the quote unquote literary based revenue. So if it becomes a novel or a play or something, then maybe the writer gets more. So 50-50 is common, but it's not necessarily the only way to go. Is there any resource that shows us examples of blank contracts for pupil ownership, artist agreements, collaboration agreements, licensing agreements, and things like this? Is something we can find on our own, or do we need to talk to literary agents or attorneys? This is going to be a very self-serving answer, but A, you're going to need to talk to an attorney, not a literary agent. B, most of these agreements are, if you look online, they're not going to be specific to the comic book industry, and comic book industry contracts are very specific relative to other forms of contracts. And C, there are only really 4 independent comic book attorneys that I know of, and I'm one of them. So if you actually need a contract, you should probably just email me and I will give you a free consultation and we'll work something out. Is there a website or referral with the help of with the selling description? Is there a website or referral for help with the selling description of your comic? I'm not sure what it is that you're asking there, so it is going to be very difficult for me to answer that question. About crowdfunding for one of our bigger series. Are you crowdfunding? I am not for or against crowdfunding in the abstract. Crowdfunding is a very powerful tool for some creators to get their books into the hands of their readers. I am against the idea of not using crowdfunding the right way. The key to using crowdfunding is actually buried in the name of the concept. If you do not have a crowd, you cannot get funding. So if your book already has a market, if there's already readers, if you already are engaged with the type of people that want to read your book, then you should definitely use crowdfunding to get the book to them, because you have the situation where you're going to be able to announce a campaign and the people who already like your book are going to buy it. If you're just starting out and you don't really have a market and you're hoping that people will naturally stumble onto your book, fall in love with it, and give you money for it, that will probably not happen. 60% of all crowdfunding campaigns fail because people do not have a crowd before they try to do their funding. So that is my general position on crowdfunding. William, on balance, do you think that going a more traditional route is worth considering how much they take from the pie when there's so many ways to do it? I think that there are certain creators and certain publishers that would actually benefit from traditional publishing and mainstream distribution. If you look at somebody like Raina Telgemeier, she started out in a very DIY type of experience, and then got a deal with like Scholastic or something, and now making millions of dollars. But that's because she was focused on the market that needed bookstore distribution, needed library distribution. She needed to actually access those younger readers. There was no way she was going to sell Smile or Guts to the extent that she did if she went through Diamond. It just wasn't going to happen. You have to, again, and I keep repeating it because it's the most important thing. You have to look at the book that you're actually making, the story that you're telling, and the people you want to tell that story to. because that's going to answer a lot of the questions that are coming up in terms of where you should put your book, how much you should actually market it, and how you're going to do all those things. If you have a book that has YA appeal or appeal to a broader market, and you can actually get the attention of an agent to pitch to a publisher, or if you can actually get in front of someone like an Aftershock or an Image or a Boom, it might make more sense to do it that way, especially if you don't want to necessarily deal with all of the post-production process. If you don't want to deal with printing and shipping and advertising and sales and royalty statements and all those other things, and you just want to make comics, okay, you just have to be willing to give up 30, 40, 50, 60% of what it is that you're making. It's not a comic, making comics, especially publishing comics, is not a one size fits all kind of thing. There's not one package. So depending on what you're doing, where you want to go, and who you want to talk to, that's where you're going to find the answers. If you are a creator who creates different stories in different genres, do you find and build a new audience for each story? Yes, because each story that you make is going to appeal to a different group of people in terms of demographic, psychographic, genre, and generation. Like if let's say you made, I don't know, Zorro, and you're going to make a Zorro comic, but the next thing you're going to do is like Human Centipede. Well, the Zorro people may not necessarily want or need to read Human Centipede, so you have to go out and find a new audience. Now, if your books have a similar theme or you're in a similar genre, you may not have to do as much like rebuilding of the wheel. Like let's say you take Alfred Hitchcock as an example. Every Alfred Hitchcock movie was different, but he was kind of appealing to the same kind of audience. So he was basically just giving them different variations on what it is that they wanted. So depending on how wildly different one story is from another of yours, that will actually determine how much of a new audience you have to build with each individual book. Joe, what is your experience with advertisers who are getting eyeballs for your series? Did you have positive experiences with them, and which ones are worth your time? Did hiring them prove to increase your click rate? Okay, if you know your market and demographics, how do you convey that to them so that they reach the audience? Working with advertisers, especially in a digital environment where you're going to advertising aggregators who are going to position your ads on a real-time bid basis based on the factors that you actually put in when you get option some of your real estate for advertising, that's going to be a function of how you're going to be able to work with them and what it is that they're going to pay in terms of a cost per click or cost per thousand. It's in most cases, unless you're going to do a very kind of couture specialized kind of advertising campaign, that you're going to need to create a sell sheet or a pitch deck for your book for an individual advertiser to get them to kind of sponsor your comic on your website. That's an option you could go with, but that is usually more labor intensive relative to the amount of money that's going to come in. That's why a lot of sites that just put advertising on their site use some kind of aggregator or ad network to kind of feed ads into their real estate on a real-time bid sort of basis. And that was not actually covered in the marketing webinar because that's advertising and not marketing, two different things.
I can add a little bit to that one very quickly, which is that having run ad operations for a bigger publishing website in the past, usually what those bigger platforms would do, or bigger websites or bigger publishers, is, like Gamal says, work with an ad network. And very often there's ad networks that will act as your ad sales representative because you are big enough. What that essentially means is that they will be doing sales directly to their clients on your behalf, where you have the veto right and the chance to opt in and opt out, etc. As far as ad rates go, you're going to find the best rates from advertisers paying in United States and Europe for obvious monetary reasons. However, you might find that, half of your readers are in South American, Southeast Asian, and African, all the rest of the world. And that traffic will not pay as well as your US-based traffic. It's one of the reasons why you see certain platforms will only pay advertising based on US traffic for folks that are uploading and publishing comics on those platforms.
Okay. At what point in the creation process should one concern themselves with registering the property for copyright? Right at the start or some ways into development? The place you should actually file the copyright for your comic is very early on in the process, probably right after you figure out that you have the right to, that you can own the idea, and right before you actually go out to recruit the team to make your comic. Now, in that case, you're not actually going to have a comic to register. So what you're going to do is what the Copyright Office calls is registering the best and latest version of your book. So if the best and latest version of your book is just the script, the character descriptions, and maybe a couple of sketches, then you should actually register that, because the earlier you have your copyright protection, the safer you're going to be in terms of any kind of infringement, either towards you or against you. You should not actually be filing your copyrights too late into the process. You should not be filing your copyrights after you've actually started working on the book. However, you can file your copyrights even after the book actually comes out and is on sale. And if you never got around to it, you can do it. But the earlier you can actually file your copyrights, the better off that you're going to be. Filing a registration for a copyright is not difficult. It is not expensive. You do not need a lawyer to do it. You just need to go to the copyright website, follow the simple instructions, and bother your uncle.
I'll take this last question, Gamal. It's Frederico's asking, is anyone using Global Comics as a crowd building tool? By that I mean I could publish something like a free issue or short teaser, create an audience large enough to start crowdfunding campaign, etc. Is that allowed on the platform? Frederico, you are so in luck. It's not only encouraged, or rather allowed, it's encouraged. And within the next month, we'll be formally launching a product that we internally call Crowdfinder. And essentially what it means is that creators of comics on Global Comics can use Global Comics to both promote and help discoverability of their comics when they are currently raising in crowdfunding. An example I'll put in chat here. You'll see that there's one active right now, and if you click through to that one, you'll see that the comic page actually takes people into the crowdfunding campaign. The thing that we're putting out is actually a tool for helping readers find and discover comics that are being crowdfunded either in the past or are actively being crowdfunded. But it goes a little bit further. The promotional tools that we have on the back end in the administration as a creator or as a publisher includes tools like giving out promo codes and generating any number of unique amount of promo codes that you can give out. Now you could give them out, you could tweet them on Twitter. You can also use them as ways to reward your digital backers. If you're working on book number 3, maybe you want to give a reward that folks have access to your previous work using Global Comics. And we have tools that are already out there, but we're putting out an improvement very, very soon that will let you do something like import my Kickstarter backers list and generate free access to them automatically. And you should be hearing more about that, end of November-ish.
Okay, here's the last question. Where should you go for help with the description of your comic to attract investors? The way you actually figure out how to describe your comic, you need 3 elements. I think you need 3 elements. You need the synopsis, which is the entire story of your comic in a nutshell. You need the pitch, which is, there's a thing called a elevator or convention pitch, and then there's a little bit longer pitch. You're going to need basically a pitch document that actually outlines every reason why a specific group of people are going to want this comic. You're going to have to explain who the demographics, the psychographics, the generation, and the genre are for your comic. You're going to have to be able to explain to your potential investors where you're going to distribute the comic, how much money you're going to make, over what period of time you're going to make their money, because investors in your book are going to want to know how they're going to get their money back and how they're going to get more money for the money they gave you. So you have to have a very specific plan that's realistic to explain to people how they're going to get their money back from your book. In comics, this is not common because most of the time, third-party investors do not want to invest in a comic for a purely financial basis because there's so much inherent risk in comics. But if you actually look at the way films are packaged for options and being greenlit, you can get a very specific idea of how to translate that model into comics to try to get outside investment. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think, I can add to that. It's the same as pitching any idea, really. And here's, the 15-second version. Know who your audience are. What do they care about? Figure out how you can answer that and make it extremely clear with as little extra text and as little extra fluff as possible. If people can skim through your pitch, it answers the questions that they have as their kind of audience, then they're at least going to have a conversation with
you. Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending the webinar. It's actually I didn't even look at the time. I didn't realize it was like 9:30. So thank you for everybody who stuck around for the whole thing. And we'll talk to everybody very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. If you guys could take a minute to fill out that feedback form, we would be eternally grateful. I'll be sending out an email with the link as well, and we'll be seeing you soon. Thanks again.